They called her Clara Boone, but in the dust-choked town of Dry Creek she was just the girl behind the bar. Every night she wiped whiskey rings from oak tables, smiled for the cowhands, and kept her eyes low when the lawmen came through. She was small, quiet, and quicker with a rag than most men were with a gun. Nobody asked where she came from. Nobody dared. Dry Creek wasn't a place you ended up by choice. It was where dreams came to die, where the sheriff's badge meant power, not justice, and where the Comanche raids in the distance were as much a threat as the men drinking at the bar. But that night changed everything. The Broken Spur saloon was full to bursting. Music jangling off the walls, cards slapped on green felt tables, a piano wheezed in the corner. And through the haze of cigar smoke, Clara saw him. The stranger in black. He didn't drink, didn't talk, just sat near the door, hat low, watching. His boots were dusty, his revolver clean. A man like that didn't come to Dry Creek unless he had ghosts or debts behind him. "Whiskey?" Clara asked, voice soft as cotton. He looked up. His eyes were steel gray, the kind that could strip your soul bare. "Just water." That got a few laughs from nearby cowhands. Nobody ordered water in Dry Creek. Clara poured it anyway. When she set the glass down, he nodded once. "Thank you, ma'am," 2 words. But something in the way he said them made her heart stutter. No one had called her mum since she'd left Abilene. The night wore on and the stranger never moved. The sheriff, Wade Kellum, a broad man with eyes like burnt coal, didn't like that. Wade owned half the town and acted like he owned the other half too. The saloon was his playground, and Clara was part of the show. "You serving strangers now, girl," Wade said, stepping up behind her, hand resting heavy on her shoulder. "Didn't I tell you, ain't no free kindness for drifters?" Clara kept her eyes down. "He paid, Sheriff." "That ain't the point." He reached for the glass, knocked it from the table. It shattered on the floor. The stranger didn't flinch, but Clara did. "She said he paid," the stranger finally said, his voice low. "You got a problem with that?" The saloon went silent. Every head turned. Wade smiled. "Yeah, I got a problem with outsiders telling my help what to do." He shoved Clara aside and squared up to the stranger. But the drifter just looked at him, calm as a man reading scripture. "Then maybe you're the problem." And before Wade could draw, the drifter stood, fast, sure, and cold as midnight. No one remembers who moved first. Some say Wade reached for his gun. Others say the drifter just turned too quick. But when the smoke cleared, Wade was on the ground, bullet through his hat, grazed ear bleeding, his pride shattered. The stranger holstered his revolver, tossed a coin on the bar. That should cover the glass. Then he walked out into the desert night. For a long moment, Clara just stared at the door. In Dry Creek, men like that didn't walk away. They disappeared, buried behind the canyon ridge. But this one, he walked into the dark like he was born of it. She didn't know his name, but she knew one thing. Her life had just changed. Because by sunrise, Sheriff Wade Kellum would come looking for blood. And when he did, he'd start with the girl behind the bar. When morning came, Dry Creek didn't wake up. It limped into the day. The sun rose red over the butte, and word had already spread faster than a prairie fire. Sheriff Wade Kellum got shown up by a stranger. And the Saloon Maid was the reason. By noon, the town had split in 2. Half said Wade had it coming. The other half said Clara Boone should have known better. Clara stood behind the bar again, same spot, same rag, pretending her hands weren't trembling. She'd wiped the same spot for 10 minutes straight. Every slam of a door made her jump. She knew the sheriff would come. The only question was when, and just before sundown the doors swung open. There he was, Wade Kellum, hat low, jaw clenched, and 4 of his deputies behind him, guns hanging loose from their belts. His ear was wrapped in a blood-stained cloth, and humiliation burned hotter than his whiskey breath. "Well," he said, "ain't this a fine sight? The little girl who started a war." No one spoke. The piano stopped. Even the air went still. Wade walked up slow, boots echoing on the wooden floor. "That drifter humiliated me in my own town. Folks are talking like I ain't fit to wear this badge." "You served him, Clara. You gave him water like he was some kind of saint." Clara's voice shook. "He paid, Sheriff. I only did my job." He leaned in close, his voice a growl. "Your job is to serve who I say." She met his eyes just for a second, and that was her mistake. Pride, even a flicker of it, was something men like Wade couldn't stand. He nodded to his men. "Take her out back." The crowd looked away, some left. Others just watched, pretending they weren't. They dragged her behind the saloon into the yard where the barrels and crates piled high. The desert wind howled between the boards. Wade followed, slow, savoring the moment. "You think you're better'n me? Serving strangers like some lady of mercy." He sneered. "I think this town don't run on fear." "I think," Clara said, her voice barely a whisper, "you're afraid of him coming back." The deputies froze. Wade's face went red. He grabbed her wrist hard and twisted. There was a sharp crack, followed by her cry that echoed off the empty canyon. Then another. And another. When he let go, Clara dropped to the ground, clutching her hands, twisted, broken things. Wade crouched beside her, his voice calm and cruel. "Now you won't serve anyone else. Not him, not me, not nobody. You're done here." He stood, spat on the dirt, and walked away. The others followed, boots kicking up dust as they went. Clara lay there for what felt like hours, her world shrinking to pain and the taste of blood. She thought she might die right there in the dirt behind the saloon, but she didn't, because after the sun went down and the moon rose high over Dry Creek, she heard a sound, soft, rhythmic, distant. Horse hooves. Out from the dark came 3 riders. They weren't white. They weren't soldiers, and they weren't afraid of this town. One of them dismounted, tall and lean, his face painted with streaks of ash and ochre. He knelt beside her, saying nothing, just studying the broken girl on the ground. "You from the Broken Spur?" he finally asked, his English heavy but clear. Clara nodded weakly. He looked back toward his riders. "She's the one." They lifted her gently, wrapped her hands in cloth and set her on the back of a horse. Why are you helping me?" she asked, barely conscious. The man's eyes met hers. "Because the one you served is Comanche blood. That was the night Dry Creek began to pay for its sins, and Clara Boone, broken, beaten and carried into the desert, would soon learn that mercy runs deeper than revenge, and sometimes the ones you fear most are the ones who save you." When Clara woke, she thought she'd died. The world was quiet, too quiet. The wind hummed through dry canyon grass, and the sky stretched out endless, painted in bruised shades of dawn. Her hands throbbed with a pain that burned straight to her bones. She tried to move but couldn't. Her wrists were bound in rough cloth, splintered with carved sticks and tied with care. A shadow moved nearby. "Don't move too fast," a woman's voice said. "Your hands need time." Clara turned her head. A woman sat cross-legged beside a small fire, grinding herbs in a stone bowl. Her face was lined from years of sun and wind, but her eyes were kind, dark and calm like river stones. Where am I?" Clara whispered. "You're safe," the woman said. "Comanche camp. 2 days' ride from Dry Creek. You were nearly gone when they brought you." Clara tried to sit, but pain flared up her arms. "Who brought me here?" The woman nodded toward the ridge. Standing there, silhouetted against the rising sun, was the man she'd served, the stranger in black. Only now, without the hat and dust, she saw him clearly for the first time. His hair was long, dark, braided with a leather tie. His eyes, the same cold steel grey, now carried something softer. He walked down the ridge, every step slow, deliberate. When he knelt beside her, Clara could smell the desert on him, smoke, horse, and sage. "You shouldn't have stayed in that town," he said quietly. She looked up at him, her voice breaking. "They broke my hands for giving you water." His jaw tightened. "I know." Silence hung heavy between them. Then he said, "My name's Tahoe. My mother was Comanche. My father was white. The sheriff called me half-breed. Folks in Dry Creek called me worse." Clara's throat tightened. "You didn't tell me." He smiled faintly, bitterly. "Didn't think I had to." For the next few days, she drifted between waking and sleep. The Comanche woman, they called her Metza, meaning healer, tended her wounds. Each time Clara opened her eyes, Tahoe was near, sitting by the fire or sharpening his blade, quiet and watchful. In her weakest hours, she asked him, Why did you come back for me?" He stared into the flames. "Because no one ever came back for me." When she grew stronger, Metza took her outside the tent. The camp lay in a hidden basin, dozens of horses grazing near the creek, children chasing lizards in the sand, women weaving under the shade of cottonwoods. Clara had never seen anything like it. It wasn't the savage chaos the newspapers painted. It was a community, alive and proud. Metza smiled at her wonder. You see, not all wild things are cruel. Some just learn to live without walls. For the first time since Dry Creek, Clara felt something she hadn't in years. Peace. But peace on the frontier never lasted long. One night, while the wind whispered low through the valley, a scout rode in fast. His horse was lathered white, eyes wide with terror. He said 3 words that made the whole camp rise to their feet. "The sheriff's coming." Tahoe stood, his face turning to stone. "He's bringing men," the scout added. 20 or more. "They're following your tracks." "He wants the girl." The air grew thick. The men checked rifles. Women pulled children close. Clara's heart sank. "He'll kill you all," she said. "He'll burn this place." Tahoe looked at her, calm but cold. "He'll try." She shook her head. "Please, Tahoe, you can't fight them." "Not for me." He stepped closer, voice low but fierce. "They hurt you for showing kindness. If we let them walk free, they'll hurt every soul that dares to do the same." That night, under the crimson light of a dying fire, Clara sat beside Metsa. "What happens now?" she asked. Metsa looked toward the dark horizon where the sheriff's posse rode. "Now, child. The white man's justice meets the desert's memory." And as the wind carried the drums of distant thunder, not from the sky, but from war horses stamping the earth, Clara realized the desert remembers what mercy forgets. The night before they rode, the camp went silent. No drums, no laughter, no songs, only the sound of steel being sharpened and horses breathing heavy in the cold. Clara sat near the fire, her splintered hands resting in her lap. The pain had dulled to a deep ache, but her fear hadn't. She watched the men preparing, bows, rifles, knives polished to mirror shine. The women packed medicine, water, dried venison. There was no panic, only purpose. Tahoe stood a few paces away, checking his Winchester rifle. The firelight carved his face in bronze and shadow. He looked carved from the same desert stone that surrounded them. "You're really going back," she said. He nodded. "Wade Kellum brought war to my people long before last week. He burned villages, hanged scouts, sold their land for whiskey and silver. This time he's riding into our ground." She swallowed hard. "You'll kill him?" Tahoe's eyes lifted to hers. "No, I'll end him." Metsa approached and placed a hand on Clara's shoulder. "He goes to protect you." "That's his heart speaking, not vengeance." Clara looked down. "And if he dies for it, then the desert will remember his name long after Dry Creek forgets yours." The words cut deep. Clara wasn't sure if that was comfort or prophecy. Before dawn they rode out, 5 Comanche warriors and Tahoe at the lead. Clara rode behind Metsa on a paint mare, the wind slicing through her hair. The desert rolled by in waves of gold and gray. By mid-morning, they reached the edge of the ridge overlooking Dry Creek. From up there, the town looked small, a patch of dust and rooftops, quiet and harmless in the distance. But Clara knew better. That saloon, those streets, they were soaked in cruelty. Below, a plume of dust rose. The sheriff's posse, 20 riders strong, guns shining in the sun. "Wade Kellum at the front. They're close," Tahoe said. "Too close to turn back." He signaled to his men, who vanished into the rocks like smoke. Clara watched them go, heart pounding. "You can't fight them all." Tahoe smiled faintly. "We won't have to." He pointed toward the canyon trail ahead. "They'll follow me through there. You and Metsa will stay here." She grabbed his arm. "Tahoe, please." But he only looked at her with that calm, impossible steadiness. "You showed kindness in a town that forgot the meaning of it. Whatever happens now, it began with that." Then he mounted his horse and rode down the slope, dust swirling in his wake. Minutes later, the posse thundered into view, shouting curses, rifles flashing in the sun. They followed Tahoe's trail into the canyon like hounds chasing blood. From the ridge, Clara watched, breath held, every heartbeat echoing in her ears. Then came the sound. A single rifle shot, then 2, then 10. Smoke rose from the canyon mouth. The sound of hooves turned to chaos, panicked shouts, screams, ricochets bouncing off rock. Metsa didn't flinch. "He knows those rocks like his own veins," she said softly, but Clara couldn't breathe. "He's outnumbered." Metsa looked at her, eyes like still water. "Numbers don't win in the desert. Spirit does." When the echoes faded, silence returned. Then a lone rider emerged from the canyon dust. It was Tahoe, blood on his shoulder, smoke on his clothes, but alive. Behind him, 2 Comanche riders followed. The rest had stayed behind to make sure no one else crawled out. He rode up to Clara, voice ragged. It's done. Wade's alive, for now. Her heart leapt. Then it's over? Tahoe shook his head. Not yet. He's headed back to town, and that's where this ends. That night they made camp near the river. Clara couldn't sleep. She stared at the fire until her eyes burned. Every time she blinked, she saw Wade's face. The sneer, the cruelty, the sound of her bones breaking. She looked at her bandaged hands. The swelling had gone down, but she knew they'd never be the same. Rest, Tahoe said softly, sitting beside her. I can't, she whispered. If you go after him, I'm coming with you. Tahoe studied her for a long time. You can't even hold a gun. I don't need to, she said. I just need to see it end. The next morning, before sunrise, they rode out again, not as fugitives this time, but as justice in the flesh. As the first light touched the horizon, the town of Dry Creek lay ahead, silent and unaware that dawn would bring reckoning, and for the first time in her life, Clara Boone wasn't afraid of the sun. Dry Creek woke to the sound of hooves. The streets were empty, but for tumbleweeds and whispers, curtains twitched. Dogs barked, then went quiet. Folks knew something was coming. They just didn't know from which direction. By mid-morning, 3 riders appeared over the ridge. Tahoe, Clara, and Metza. The Comanche banners were gone. No war cries, no painted faces. Just quiet resolve. They rode straight down Main Street, every step echoing against the false fronts of shops and saloons. The townsfolk watched from behind shutters, remembering how fast this place turned on its own. At the far end of the street stood the Broken Spur Saloon, the same place where it all began. Sheriff Wade Kellum was waiting out front. His hat was gone, his left arm bandaged and his pride hanging by a thread. Around him stood what was left of his posse, 6 men, scared but too proud to show it. When Tahoe reined in his horse, Wade spat into the dust. Well, I'll be damned. You actually came back. Tahoe's voice was steady. You broke a woman's hands for giving water to a man. You burned homes that weren't yours to touch. Now you're going to answer for it. Wade smirked, though his voice trembled just a little. Ain't no one here to judge me, half-breed. The law's what I say it is. Clara dismounted slowly. Every movement was agony, but she forced herself to stand tall. Then maybe it's time the law learned how to bleed, the crowd gasped. Wade's smirk faded. You should have stayed gone, girl. Nobody wants you here. Then why are they watching? She said. And she was right. Faces filled the windows, shadows lined the rooftops. The whole town had gathered in silence. Wade drew first, fast and faster than most men could think. But Tahoe was faster still. One shot cracked the morning air. The sheriff's revolver flew from his hand, spinning into the dust. Tahoe didn't lower his weapon. How you can still walk away? Wade laughed bitterly. Walk away? You think I'll let savages and saloon trash make a fool out of me again? He lunged for his deputy's gun, and that's when Clara stepped forward. Her hands trembled, wrapped in cloth and scars, but her voice was steady. You said I was done serving, remember? I froze. She lifted a pistol, the one Tahoe had given her, small and light enough for her broken grip. I ain't serving anymore, she said. Not you, not fear, not anyone. For a long moment, no one breathed. The wind whistled through the saloon's broken shutters. Wade's eyes flicked to the crowd, looking for support, for loyalty, for anything. But no one moved. No one backed him. The same men who had laughed while she was beaten now looked away, ashamed. He sneered. You don't have it in you. Clara's jaw trembled. Maybe not. But the desert does. And with that she lowered the gun, not to fire but to step aside. Behind her, Tahoe pulled the trigger. One clean shot. Wade Kellum fell where he stood. Silence fell heavy. When the dust settled, Tahoe holstered his gun and turned to the townsfolk. There's your law. Do better with it. No one spoke. Not one soul. Clara turned toward the saloon. The piano sat silent, the same rag still hanging on the counter where she'd left it. She walked inside, the floorboards creaking under her boots. She stood behind the bar one last time, looking out at the empty room. Her reflection stared back from the mirror. The girl behind the bar was gone. Only Clara Boone remained. When she stepped back outside, the Comanche riders were already turning their horses east, toward the open plains. Tahoe lingered a moment longer. You could come with us, he said softly. No more towns. No more walls. Clara looked toward the desert, endless, wild, free. Then back at the saloon where her blood had mixed with dust. I think I'll stay, she said. Someone's got to remember what happened here. Tahoe nodded once. Then remember this, wise mercy ain't weakness. It's the hardest thing left in this world. He tipped his hat and rode off, disappearing into the horizon where the sky burned golden red. That evening, Dry Creek was quieter than it had been in years. Folks said the saloon never reopened. Some said Clara left one morning and walked east, hands still wrapped in cloth. Others said she stayed and rebuilt it herself, one board at a time. But those who were there, those who saw it happen, still tell the story the same way. A saloon maid broke no law but kindness. They broke her hands for it, and when the desert answered, it did not whisper. When the dust finally settled over Dry Creek, the silence was heavier than the smoke that clung to the streets. The sheriff was dead. The saloon stood empty, and for the first time in years, the air didn't smell like fear. Clara Boone sat on the wooden steps outside the Broken Spur, her bandaged hands resting in her lap. The morning light crept over the rooftops, painting the town gold, the same gold that used to draw men here chasing luck, greed or trouble. Now nobody was chasing anything. A few townsfolk wandered out, slow and careful, as if afraid to break the spell. The blacksmith, the preacher, even old man Reddick, who hadn't spoken to anyone since his son died in one of Wade's raids. They didn't look at Clara with pity this time. They looked at her with something else, something that felt almost like respect. "Mom," the preacher said finally, his voice cracking, "I reckon we owe you a word of thanks." Clara looked up. "Don't thank me. Just don't forget what you saw." He nodded slowly, hat in hand. "Ain't likely we ever will." As the sun climbed higher, the Comanche disappeared into the horizon. No raiding, no vengeance, just quiet departure. A few men started to whisper that maybe they hadn't come for blood after all. Maybe they'd come to show what real justice looked like. Clara didn't speak. She just watched the trail fade into the desert haze. That's when Deputy Eli Crowder approached. He was young, too young to have worn a badge under Wade, but he'd done it anyway. He stood a few feet away, hat clutched tight, guilt etched into every line of his face. "I didn't stop him," he said softly. When he hurt you, I should have." "I didn't." Clara turned her head slightly. "You were scared?" He nodded. "Still am." "Good," she said. "Means you're still human." He blinked, confused. "What are you going to do now?" She looked at her hands, the stiff bandages, the swollen fingers that would never bend the same way again. "I'm going to build something honest," she said, "even if it's just a place to pour a drink without fear." The following days moved like slow molasses. The townsfolk buried the sheriff out by the old oak. No one said a word over his grave. No preacher, no tears, just a hole in the dirt and a name they didn't want to remember. By the next week, a new sign hung over the saloon door, hand-painted, rough, but clear. The desert rose. Clara stood beneath it, her apron tied loose, her hands still wrapped in cloth. She wasn't the same woman who had once smiled politely behind the bar. This time there was no pretending. The first customer that walked in was the blacksmith. He took off his hat, nodded, and sat down. "Whiskey," he said. Clara smiled faintly. "Water with it?" He hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, water." And that's how it started. One by one, the people of Dry Creek returned, not for sin or whiskey or fights, but for quiet company, for a place that didn't belong to fear anymore. That evening, Clara sat outside again, watching the sunset turn the sky to fire. Eli Crowder came by, setting a small tin star on the step beside her. "What's that?" she asked. "Town's badge," he said. "Don't reckon anyone's fit to wear it but you." She chuckled softly. "I ain't no lawman," he smiled. "No, but you did more for this town than any of us with a badge ever did." Clara looked at the star gleaming in the fading light. For a moment she didn't see her broken hands. She saw what they'd built instead. That night, as the wind rolled through the desert, a lantern glowed inside the desert rose. No piano music. No shouting. Just quiet laughter, the sound of glasses clinking, and the hum of something this town hadn't heard in years. Peace. But out beyond the horizon, where the desert swallowed the sun, a single rider moved through the dust. Tahoe. He didn't look back, but somewhere deep inside, he knew that a town once rotten had been given back its heart, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough. By the time the desert winds turned cool again, Dry Creek had started to look less like a wound and more like a scar. The gallows came down. The gunfight stopped, And for the first time since anyone could remember, children played in the street without someone yelling at them to get inside. But the memory of what happened still hung in the air, like a song everyone knew the tune to, but no one dared to sing. Inside the Desert Rose, Clara Boone poured drinks slowly, steadying each bottle with bandaged hands. Her fingers were stiff, but she'd learned to move with patience instead of speed. Every motion was deliberate, not graceful but strong. The bar looked different now. The piano cleaned and tuned. The mirrors replaced, and on the far wall above the shelves of glass and whiskey hung a single silver star. The old badge Eli Crowder had given her. She didn't wear it. She just kept it there, a reminder of what power looked like when it wasn't poisoned by cruelty. Eli came by most evenings. He'd taken up the sheriff's post after all. The town needed someone to sign papers, keep peace, mend fences. But he always said the real law in Dry Creek sat behind the bar, not behind a desk. "You know," he said one night, leaning against the counter, "words travelin' fast. Folks from Abilene to Amarillo are talking about the saloon maid who stood up to the law." Clara chuckled softly. "People love a story," he nodded. "They do, but this one's true." She gave him a look. "True don't always mean clean. I did what I had to. That's what makes it worth telling," he said. Every few weeks, a stranger would ride into town as a drifter, a farmer, a widow. They'd stop by the Desert Rose, ask quiet questions, then sit down for a drink. Some came to see the woman who defied a sheriff. Others came to feel what a free town sounded like. Clara never turned anyone away. When they asked what happened that day, she didn't boast or dramatize. She'd just say, "I gave a man water, and the desert gave me back my name." One afternoon, a boy came running through the doors, hat too big, boots too small. "Miss Clara?" he shouted. "There's a man outside. Says he's got something for you." She frowned, wiped her hands, and stepped into the sunlight. A single rider waited by the hitching post. Horse black as coal. Hat pulled low, her breath caught. Tahoe dismounted, slower than before, older maybe, so just more tired. He carried no rifle, only a small leather satchel. "Didn't think I'd see you again," she said quietly. He smiled faintly. "You made it easy to find me. Towns that stay alive leave footprints." He handed her the satchel. Inside was a folded cloth, soft doeskin embroidered with careful hands. She unfolded it and found what looked like a small necklace made of turquoise and bone. "It's a medicine charm," he said. "Metza made it. Said you'd need it more than we do." Clara's eyes softened. "Is she well?" "She is," Tahoe said. "The plains are calm again. For now." He looked around the street, clean, quiet, full of life. "Who fixed this place?" She shook her head. "I just gave it a chance to breathe." They stood there a long moment, the kind of silence that carries more than words. When he finally turned to leave, Clara called out, "Tahoe." He stopped. "You'll always have water here," she said. He nodded once. "And you'll always have friends in the wind." Then he rode off, fading into the horizon once more, a ghost not of death, but of survival. That night, Clara hung the medicine charm beside the sheriff's star. Two symbols side by side, mercy and justice tied together in dust and blood. The piano started to play again. The laughter returned. And for the first time in Dry Creek's long, bitter history, the town finally breathed easy. By spring, the desert had softened. Wildflowers sprouted along the wagon trails, and the wind that once howled through Dry Creek now carried something different, stories. They drifted from mouth to mouth, town to town, spreading like wildfire. Some said Clara Boone shot the sheriff herself. Others swore the Comanche had crowned her queen of the desert. And a few, mostly drunks who loved a good, Shanty claimed she'd faced down a dozen. Outlaws with nothing but a whiskey bottle and a stare cold enough to freeze a rattlesnake mid-strike. None of it was true, and all of it was. At the Desert Rose, the stories came home to roost. Travelers from as far as Dodge City stopped by to see the place, as if it was some kind of shrine. Cowboys, soldiers, ranchers, even a pair of newspapermen rode in one dusty afternoon. Jotting down notes and asking questions she refused to answer. They called her Miss Boone, though she'd long since dropped the title. "I ain't anyone's miss," she told them. "I just pour drinks," but even she knew that wasn't true anymore. The Desert Rose had become something more than a saloon. It was a kind of refuge. Men came here to lay down their burdens, to drink without judgment, to talk about the dead without fear of laughter. And women, who had once been shadows in the corners of the saloon, began to walk in with their heads high, knowing no man would touch them without her say-so. One hot afternoon, Eli Crowder stepped through the swinging doors with a newspaper folded under his arm. "Look at this," he said, laying it on the bar. The headline read, "The Maid Who Broke the Law, How One Woman Stood Against the West's Cruelest Sheriff." Clara read it slowly, her mouth tightening as she went. The words painted her as a heroine, a symbol of courage, the spirit of the new frontier. When she finished, she looked up. "You believe this?" Eli shrugged. "Parts of it. They make it sound like I had a plan," she said. "Like I knew what I was doing." "Maybe you did," Eli said quietly. "Just didn't know it yet." She folded the paper and slid it back across the counter. "I didn't do it for a story. I did it because it was wrong to stay quiet." He smiled faintly. "That's why it's a story worth telling." The legend kept growing. A wagon train from Kansas stopped to rest in town and told Clara they'd heard of her as far east as St. Louis. An old cavalry captain rode in, offered her a job as camp cook for the U.S. Army. A respectable position for a brave woman, he'd said. She'd laughed him out of the saloon, but it wasn't all admiration. Some men muttered that Dry Creek had gone soft, that a woman running a saloon made the place weak. One of them, a cattle buyer from Abilene, made the mistake of saying it too loud. Eli was halfway to standing when Clara raised a hand. "Sir," she said evenly, "you can finish your drink, or you can finish your sentence." But not both. The man stared at her for a moment, eyes narrowing. Then he looked at her hands, the stiff scars where her bones had once been broken, and decided silence was wiser. He left without another word. That night, when the last customer was gone, Clara sat alone with a lantern and the medicine charm Tahoe had given her. The turquoise glimmered in the dim light, blue as the desert sky before sunrise. She thought of the Comanche girl, Metsa, of the way she'd stood her ground beside her people, proud and unbending. Maybe they weren't so different. Maybe the West was finally changing, not because of guns or gold, but because of the quiet strength of those who refused to bow anymore. Outside, the wind picked up again. It carried the faint sound of music from down the street, a harmonica, slow and sweet. Clara smiled to herself. She didn't chase the sound. She didn't need to. The town was alive, and that was enough. Weeks later, a letter arrived. No name, no return address. Just a single line written in neat, careful handwriting. "You gave the desert a soul again." She kept it tucked behind the bar, right beside the silver star. As summer came, travelers spoke of the desert rose, the way they spoke of old forts or lost gold. A landmark not found on any map, but known to everyone worth knowing. They said the whiskey there never ran dry. The barkeep never lied, and if you walked in with hate in your heart, you'd leave with less of it. Clara didn't correct them. Truth had done its part. Now it was legend's turn, and out beyond the town, somewhere past the red mesas, a figure rode under a moonlit sky. Tahoe again, or maybe just another wanderer who'd heard the story and took comfort in knowing the desert still had good people left. Either way, the wind carried her name across the plains, whispering through canyons, echoing through time. Clara Boone, the saloon maid who made the desert breathe. By late summer, Dry Creek had learned to sleep easy again. The nights were quiet, the kind of quiet only the desert can offer, that deep, endless hush beneath a billion stars. The clinking of glasses from the desert rose was the town's lullaby, and Clara Boone had become something between a guardian and a ghost of her own legend, always there, always watching. But peace, in the West, never rides alone for long. It began one evening just before sundown. A dust cloud rose on the horizon, not big enough for a cattle drive, not fast enough for a storm. The blacksmith, polishing a new horseshoe outside his shop, stopped mid-hammer and squinted toward the ridge. By the time he saw the glint of rifles in the sunset, he was already shouting, "Riders coming! 4, maybe 5. Within minutes, the streets emptied. Doors shut, windows latched. Dry Creek might have learned peace, but it hadn't forgotten how to hide. Clara stepped outside the desert rose, wiping her hands on her apron. Eli Crowder appeared beside her, rifle slung across his shoulder, jaw tight. "Any chance they're just passing through?" she asked. Eli shook his head. "No one rides that slow unless they're looking for something." The riders came down the street 2 by 2, horses sleek and mean. At their head was a man in a black duster and a silver-trimmed hat. He carried himself like someone who thought the world owed him its silence. When he stopped in front of the saloon, his horse snorted and pawed the dirt. "You Clara Boone?" he asked, his voice low and steady. Clara nodded once. "Depends who's asking." He tipped his hat slightly. "Name's Silas Dree. Used to work the frontier south of here, before your sheriff got himself killed." Eli stiffened. "You knew Wade?" Silas smiled. "Knew him? Hell, I rode with him. He owed me money, and now seems I gotta collect it from whoever took his place." Eli's rifle came up fast, but Clara's hand stopped him. "What do you want, Mr. Dree?" she asked. He dismounted, slow and deliberate, his boots kicking up dust. "Word is you've got a bar full of gold and goodwill. I figure you pay me what Wade owed, and we'll leave your pretty little town in one piece." A murmur rippled from the few townsfolk peeking through their shutters. Clara's eyes narrowed. "And if I don't?" He smiled, the kind of smile that made the air colder. Then Dry Creek learns that legends don't stop bullets. For a moment no one moved. Even the wind seemed to hold still. Then Clara spoke, voice calm as a drawn blade. "You think this town's soft because a woman runs it?" Silas shrugged. "I think you've been lucky." "Luck didn't keep me alive," she said. "Principle did." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Principle don't buy mercy." Clara stepped closer, her boots steady on the boards. "No, but it earns it. Sometimes." For a second his grin faltered. Then Eli chambered around, the sharp click echoing down the street. "You got one chance, Dree. Ride out now and live." Silas turned his head slowly toward him. "You're the new lawman?" "That's right." "Well," Dree said, spitting into the dirt, "let's see if you bleed like the old one." The draw was quick, quicker than anyone expected. Dree's pistol flashed, but Eli fired first. The crack of the rifle split the evening in two. When the smoke cleared, Dree was on the ground, clutching his shoulder, his gun still smoking in his hand. The other riders froze, unsure. Unready, Clara's voice cut through the haze. "You men want to die for his debts?" None of them answered. She took a step forward, eyes hard. "Then take him. Leave him at the edge of the valley. He gets to live because this town don't kill for pride anymore." The silence stretched heavy and long. Then one of the men nodded. They lifted Dree onto his horse, turned, and rode out the way they came. When the last hoofbeat faded, the whole town exhaled at once. Eli leaned against a post, breathing hard. "Didn't think they'd back off." Clara looked at the fading dust. "Men like that only understand one thing, someone standing taller than their fear." He glanced at her bandaged hands, the faint scars catching the light. "You still got that, huh?" She smiled faintly. "I ain't lost it yet." That night, Dry Creek gathered in the Desert Rose, not for celebration, but for quiet thanks. No one played the piano. No one sang. They just sat together, drinking in the calm after the storm, knowing that peace wasn't something you were given, it was something you defended. Clara poured the last drink of the night and stepped outside. The sky was clear again. The wind carried no danger, only the soft whisper of sagebrush and the far-off cry of a coyote. She looked out toward the desert, where the riders had vanished. Maybe more would come. Maybe peace never truly stayed, but Dry Creek would be ready. Because a town that had once bowed to cruelty now stood on its own 2 feet, scarred, stubborn and free, and at its heart was a woman who had already lost everything but her will. That, she knew, was the kind of power no outlaw could ever take. The summer of 1879 ended like all things in the desert do, quietly, without warning. The air grew cooler. The wind softened. The land, once harsh and unyielding, seemed to finally rest. And in the small, sun-baked town of Dry Creek, life had found its rhythm again. Each morning, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer echoed through the streets. The general store opened early, selling flour, nails, and sometimes hope. And every evening, the amber glow from the Desert Rose spilled out onto the dusty street, warm as a hearth. Clara Boone stood behind her bar, steady as ever, her hands marked, but unshaken. The scars had faded to white lines, reminders, not wounds. No one called her Miss anymore. No one called her Maid. She was just Clara, and that was enough. A week after Silas Dree's men were driven out, travelers brought word that he'd died from infection out in the Badlands. Some said buzzards found him first. Others said the Comanche did. Clara didn't celebrate. She just poured a glass of whiskey, set it outside on the porch and whispered, "For the dead, may they rest where peace finds them." Then she went back to work. The days rolled by like wagon wheels on a long trail, steady, simple and certain. But as autumn came, something changed. Dry Creek started to fill with strangers again. Not troublemakers, but pilgrims of a kind. People who'd heard stories. They came from Abilene, Wichita, even San Antonio. Men and women who wanted to see the place they'd only heard about in campfire tales. The saloon where a woman defied a sheriff. The town that stood its ground. The desert that refused to die. One evening, as the orange light of sunset painted the horizon, Clara stepped out onto the porch and saw a familiar figure riding in slow from the east. A single rider, no dust cloud, no gun on his hip, just an old grey horse and a wide-brimmed hat. When he dismounted, she smiled. "Didn't expect to see you again." "Tahoe," she said, her voice soft. He nodded, eyes warm with quiet pride. "The wind carried your name, Clara Boone, even to the far plains." "You still ridin'?" she asked. "Still livin'," he said. "Still listening." They stood in silence for a while, watching the last light fade behind the mesas. Tahoe finally said, "You did what most can't. You gave death a reason to rest." Clara chuckled. "I just gave folks a place to sit down without fear," he smiled. "That's the same thing." They shared a drink that night, one glass between them, the whiskey burning warm in the cool air. Tahoe told her that his people had moved further north, away from the old fighting trails. The Comanche were changing just like the land, learning new ways, keeping the old ones close. Before he left, he placed a small bundle on her table, another medicine charm. This one carved from antler and turquoise. "For when the wind turns cold," he said, "to remind you that peace isn't silence, it's the sound of people still standing." Clara held it tight. "Tell Metza thank you." "I will," he said, smiling. She still remembers the woman who poured water for strangers. When morning came, Tahoe was gone. Only his hoofprints remained, fading into the sand. Clara stood at the edge of town, watching them vanish. Then she went back inside, hung the new charm beside the old one, two small pieces of the desert's heart, glowing softly in the lamplight. Years passed. Dry Creek grew. A schoolhouse went up. The church bell rang again, and the desert rose stayed open, not as a saloon of vice, but as a gathering place for every soul who needed shelter. A story, or a stiff drink to forget the miles behind them. Children grew up hearing her name whispered in the streets. Young women looked to her with quiet awe. Men, even the roughest kind, spoke her name with respect and a hint of fear. On her final evening behind the bar, Clara poured her last glass of whiskey. Her hair was silver now, tied back neat, her eyes sharp as ever. Eli Crowder, older, slower, but still wearing his badge, sat across from her. "You ever think about leaving this place?" he asked. Clara smiled. "And go where?" "Every road leads back here," he nodded. "Guess you're right. This town's got your name carved into it now." She looked toward the window, the sun dipping low, bathing the saloon in gold. "No," she said quietly. "It's got everyone's name. Mine just got written first." The last thing Clara Boone saw before she closed the Desert Rose for the night was the horizon, the desert stretching wide and endless, the same as it ever was, and in that fading light, the wind carried voices, laughter, music, the clink of glasses, the sound of a town that finally found its peace. They buried her under the old oak by the ridge, where the sun hit first each morning. The townsfolk built a small wooden marker, simple and true, Clara Boone. She poured water for the thirsty and gave the desert its soul years later. Travelers still found their way to Dry Creek. They'd stop in the rebuilt saloon, and still called the Desert Rose, and ask the barkeep, was she real? The woman who faced down the sheriff, who saved this town. And the barkeep, usually smiling, would point to the wall, where the two charms still hung side by side, turquoise and antler, medicine and memory. Then he'd say, real enough to leave her mark, real enough to make this desert bloom. And when the sun sank low over Dry Creek, the sky turned the same deep red as the roses that grew by the porch, the only flowers hardy enough to live in the dust. Some said the wind carried her name still. Others said it carried her laughter, but all agreed on one thing. Clara Boone never left the West, she just became part of it. If you enjoyed this story, Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more unforgettable tales from me. And make sure to tap the bell icon so you never miss a new episode. Thanks for watching.